Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I titled my talk, Understanding the Utility of Haptic Feedback in Telerobotic Devices, but as I went through the talks yesterday, I realized that actually what I really want to talk to you about is understanding sensory motor control in telerobotic devices. And then I get an opportunity to muse a little bit about how I think some of the work that we're doing in telerobotics lends itself to the neurorehabilitation space. Because I had the fortune of sitting next to Amy yesterday, I'm going to take a note out of her book. And in my presentation, I'm going to sort of get to the challenges de facto at the end of my talk. But I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of insight of the work that we're doing in my lab. We did have the pleasure of having Doug come talk. We like to build things in my lab. I liken myself to sort of, like a biologist that studies cells using microscopes. We study humans using robots. We just have the great fortune of also having to build those robots as well. Without going forward anymore, I just want to acknowledge all of the students in my lab, the Haptics and Medical Robotics Laboratory, who've done all the amazing work that I have the pleasure of talking to you about today. To motivate this talk, we know that we use our limbs, in particular our upper extremity limbs, to do tasks throughout our daily living that often require a lot of dexterity, whether for work or for play. If I simplify the problem, right, dexterity sort of relies on both feed forward and feedback pathways, right? We know oftentimes our manipulations in the environment are sort of driven by sort of observing things first. Then we have commands that come out efferent, from the brain out to the periphery, cause the muscles to move, and then also, the afferent pathways that go from the periphery back up to the brain in this sort of closed loop control scheme. My lab really focuses on this afferent pathway, right? So the sense of touch and how important the sense of touch is in this closed loop sensory motor control loop. And in particular, what we look at are a class of robots that we call telerobots. So basically, their goal is to extend our reach and extend our dexterity into environments that we normally can't operate in, either because, the environments pose dangers to our body, they're hazardous, they're at different scales, or our body itself has been changed in conformation, as in the case of an amputation. So when we think about sort of human, sensory motor control loops when it comes to telerobotics, as roboticists, we've gotten very good at sort of taking user intent, right, and being able to carry out that intent on the environment on our behalf. Oftentimes, because we build these nice robots, they're outfitted with a suite of sensors that sort of measure the interactions between between the robot and the environment. The problem is we often don't pass that sensory information back to the human operators. And so what my lab does, and others that focus in this space, are thinking about how do we add these haptic interfaces to basically restore this dexterous control loop. So I'm going to talk to you about sort of two classes of telerobots that we work in my lab: upper limb prosthetic limbs, limb prostheses, as well as minimally invasive surgical robotics devices. The two projects that I'm going to talk about today in prosthetic space was done by my former PhD student and postdoc, Dr. Neha Thomas. My lab and others have shown many times over that when you add haptic information to an upper limb prosthesis, it allows the user, the prosthesis wearer, to be able to do tasks better than they could without sort of the haptic feedback present, right? We sort of know that getting this haptic information allows you to close the sensory motor loop, and thus you can do more dexterous tasks. But we've been sort of more recently in our lab starting to ask this other question of at what cost, right? And in particular, we begin to think about computational costs from the perspective of the human in the loop and cognitive effort. And so in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Hassan Ayaz, who's at Drexel University, we begin to thinking about looking at, upper limb prosthesis control from both the task performance perspective. So let's just hypothetically say I gave you this ball of some stiffness, you squeezed it, and I said, tell me how stiff the object is, right? But then also saying, now how much effort did it take you to actually do that task, right? And so we've been using this sort of, going around using this terminology we call neural efficiency, very similar to sort of what Steve talked about yesterday when we think about lower extremity world. And in fact, I started my career as a grad student in the Art Cole's lab with Steve, thinking about metabolic cost and cost of transport. But now we're thinking in the upper extremity, sort of this new idea of efficiency from the idea of you doing the task and what is the cognitive effort that it takes. And so the simplest way to think about it is if a task takes if you're able to do the task very well, so high task performance, and not take a lot of of, let's say, mental energy or mental effort to do the task, we would say that you've got really good neural efficiency. On the contrary, if you do the task very bad, or it takes you a lot of mental effort, you have to think very hard to do the task, we say you sort of got low neural efficiency. And this, Hassan has been sort of, I would say preaching this idea of what we call neuroergonomics, right? So beginning to think about human device interaction from a very cognitive or neural sort of perspective. So our first experiment, pretty simple. It was a two alternative force choice object discrimination experiment, right? So I have three objects that have different stiffnesses. I give you two of them at any given time. I say, squeeze one, squeeze the other. Tell me which one was stiffer. Right. We did this through a mock prosthesis, which you can kind of see in the middle graphic on the left-hand side. So working with, individuals without limb loss, which is why there's a nice little bulge in the hand here. But they have a prosthesis with a little force sensor on the end of one of the prehensors that we then map to a vibral tactile actuator that the user is wearing on their arm. And so proportionally, the harder you squeeze, the larger the force, the bigger the amplitude of vibration that we provide on the arm. What you see in the top left-hand side is a neuroimaging modality called FNIRS, functional near infrared spectroscopy, which basically looks in the prefrontal cortex. And again, this is mechanical engineering saying it, looking at how much oxygenated, deoxygenated hemoglobin is there, and due to principles of neurovascular coupling, can kind of tie that to mental effort and cognitive load, specifically in the prefrontal cortex. And then the other thing that we're really interested in sort of the prosthetics world is how does this compare to the gold standard, which is your natural limb, right? And we, by using, in this case, individuals without limb loss, we get the added benefit of they can do the same task with their intact, healthy limb. And so what you'll see in the bottom right-hand figure is someone wearing a little piezo-resistive force sensor that we put on the finger and ask them to do this task again. So three conditions. We have a prosthesis without feedback. We have a prosthesis that gives feedback, in this case, vibral tactile feedback of grip force. And then we ask them to do the same task with their natural limb. Of course, counterbalance and randomize and the like. And I'm going to sort of collapse all the results and basically talk about neural efficiency. Where again, reminding you, it's how well did they do the task versus how much mental effort did it take them to do the task. And what we find, if we start on the left, the solid blue block here, is that the natural limb, in this case, that's what the blue block represents, is very neurally efficient, right? You can, in most of our cases, participants were 100% accurate. And the amount of mental effort that it took them to do the task was actually very low from like a baseline measure that we take at the beginning, right? So really good neural efficiency, we'd sort of expect that. You've got prior experience using your limbs sort of on a daily basis. When we look at the prosthesis without feedback, which is this yellow polka dot on the right-hand side, we actually see that it's actually, sort of negative efficiency, right? Participants were basically guessing. We didn't block, auditory cues or anything like that, so they could hear the motors like a real prosthesis wearer would. But by and large, we didn't give them any information about grip force. And so they were sort of guessing as to what the objects were. And because they were guessing, right, and they were trying to make educated guesses, they actually spent a lot of mental energy doing that. So they had very low task performance and very high mental effort. And so they had very negative neural efficiency in this case. When we add the haptic feedback in, which you see in the middle bar here, we start to get a little bit, sort of heading in the right direction, positive efficiency. So pretty good task performance, not nearly as good as the natural limb, but much lower cognitive effort than it takes when you don't have this haptic information. And so what's nice about it is that, there have been sort of contrasting views around whether giving this added haptic information will actually cause more mental effort, because now you have to pay attention to an extra cue. But it seems like in this case, this extra information gets processed very efficiently and you're able to use it to do the task. And then the end result is that your cognitive effort goes down over time. So what we've been doing since then, this study is sort of trying to come up with more complicated tasks. And so, as a grad student, I was very fascinated by the early Johansson and Flanagan papers with the grasp and lift studies, where you show these like really beautiful economical grasp styles and people go to grab an object and pick it up, right? You don't grab it as hard as you want to, you just grab it just strong enough to keep it from slipping. And then we begin to say, well, what happens now if the object sort of has undesirable properties that force you to not grasp hard. And so what you're going to see in this video here is a little instrument and object that we created in our lab that if you grab too hard, it actually collapses, right? The wall collapses down like it would happen in the case if you were picking up an egg and you squeeze an egg too hard, right? Much easier to build a device like this and break it as opposed to breaking eggs in the lab. And we can control it, right? We can set the force, the breaking threshold. We can also set the weight inside the object as well, so we can change the weight without participants knowing. And so what what we create is this sort of, sweet spot zone where if you don't grasp our object hard enough, it slips, but if you grab it too hard, it breaks, right? And so we want to get fine level control out. We've also started going in our lab in the direction of thinking about excuse me, how do we combine good, let's say, volitional control in the prostheses with thinking about ways of doing autonomous control with the prosthesis as well. And this is some work that Neha started when she was on the Fulbright Fellowship at the Max Planck Institute in Stuttgart, thinking about this idea of shared control. How do you do shared control between these two systems? And so what we have is a shared control device, basically, that does more of a mimicry style. You teach the prosthesis how to pick the object up the first time. It learns what you did successfully. And then the next time you go try and pick the object up, it basically tries to replay what you did the first time. So what grip force did you use? Was that grip force successful? And so what we begin to say is now let's look at sort of this shared control framework, human and sort of autonomous system working together. Do we get better performance? And in particular, do we get better neural efficiency when these two systems are sort of working together? And again, collapsing the results here and basically showing you that what we found is that when you do have this shared control framework, right, participants were able to pick the object up more times, and the mental effort that they expended to pick the object up more times was actually lower than it was the case when they didn't have the haptic feedback. This is a little bit of an interesting result because in order to train this autonomous system, you actually have to use volitional control with haptic feedback first, right? So participants go in sort of not knowing what the right grip force is and determining how to squeeze the object appropriately to pick it up. But once the system learns, and again, the limitation here is that you have to train it each time, but once it learns, it's able to help you do the task. And by helping you do the task, you're able to lower over the course of the number of trials that you do, the cognitive effort that you expend to be able to successfully pick it up and put it back down. So we've now recently been trying to try this out with actual prosthesis wearers. I get the great fortune of picking, some of the best videos to show you. But we had a participant in our lab that came in with a clinically prescribed prosthesis, which you see here in the black glove, cosmesis glove, trying to do the task, basically pick the object up, put it back down. I don't know if sound's going to play, but hopefully you'll hear it click, right? Every time she tries to grab it, it just clicks, which means she's squeezing it too hard. Then what we did is we let her try the system out with our lab prosthesis, which you'll see in the next video here. The only thing we did, again, sort of used her standard socket, put our different hand now. We just use sort of a standard an Autobach hand and our autonomous control system or sort of shared control system. And what we found is that in the majority of the cases, the participant was able, about 50% of the time, she was able to actually pick the object up and put it back down. So, not 100% accuracy in this case. And again, this is sort of an anecdotal N equals 1. But by and large, you can see she just broke it. We were able to get about a 50% increase in the number of times that she was actually able to successfully pick the object up and put it back down. Now, I will say the caveat here is we also did sort of change the control scheme. So her standard clinical prosthesis uses pattern recognition to do control. This one, we're using more of a proportional EMG controller. But again, once she trained it and learned what was the right amount of grip force to pick it up, the system then just goes and replays it and she can do it over and over and over again. If it breaks, right, she has to go back and retrain. And so it's sort of this interplay of those two things. Okay, so moving out of the prosthetic space into the surgical robotic space, this is some work done by a former student of mine, Guido Kaschiniga. So when you think about surgical training, sort of the majority of time in the surgical training space, it's done in the VR space. They're VR trainers, oftentimes because, the robots are sort of seeing a lot of clinical use actually in the ORs. But when you talk to surgeons, they will say that sort of the gold standard is still sitting on the robot and sort of learning with the robot, because it's been shown that actually, when you operate on the robot, you learn something about the robot's dynamics and you incorporate those dynamics into your control scheme. We begin to say, are these two things the same? Can you learn as well in the virtual world as you can in the physical world? And so what Guido did is he built this experimental setup where with the same sort of device, in this case, we're using the open source Da Vinci Research Kit robot, we now can map that input to both a virtual task and a physical task that are exact analogs of each other. They're scaled appropriately and everything like that. So you can see now, sort of same input in the middle, we're mapping it to the real world on the right-hand side, and then mapping it into the virtual world on the left-hand side. It's the exact same task as a needle driving task. So you take this sort of curved suture needle and you're driving it through these 3 rings. And we're giving you visual feedback, basically, of how well you're actually doing the task. So are you deviating from this ideal trajectory? And what we did is we ran an experiment where we said, how well do you learn in each of these environments, virtual and real? Here we're calling real inanimate because that's sort of the clinical way they describe, the real world. And then, if you learn in one of these environments, how well does the skill that you learn transfer to the other? So what we did is an experiment where you have a baseline measure that we take. We give you, 40 chances to try the task in that environment. We do an evaluation of how well did you actually learn the skill, and then we do a crossover. How well did you take that skill? How well can you take the skills that you learn in one environment to the other? And then we also did this sort of looking at you see sham here, because Guido got really interested in non-invasive brain stimulation. And so we started looking at, there's been some evidence to show that transcranial direct current stimulation has been used to improve motor learning. And this is something that we thought about doing sort of in the training space. Could we see a benefit here of, non-invasive brain stimulation, or TDCS, when it comes to this motor learning task? And so I'm going to sort of, again, collapse some results here. We had people do it at 3 different speeds because we're very interested in the speed accuracy trade-off. But I'm going to focus in on the moderate speed because that represents sort of your normal, speed at which someone would actually do the task. And basically what we find on the left-hand side is that from baseline to training, the red to the green block, people got better. Right? Or excuse me, baseline to evaluation. So during training, they learned how to basically do the task better over and over and over again. Better in this case is lower errors. So closer to 0 on the y-axis. And then when you look at the inanimate training of the real world, from baseline, or excuse me, evaluation in green to cross evaluation in blue, we basically saw they didn't get any better, they didn't get any worse, right? So whatever they learned, they were able to sort of retain and take it into the virtual environment. So learning in the physical world, they were able to take the skill learning in the physical world, they were able to take the skill into the virtual world. On the right-hand side, we see the opposite of that. Basically, they still learn in the virtual environment. You get better over time from baseline to evaluation. But when they went from sort of evaluation in the virtual world to evaluation in the real world, they actually got significantly worse. Errors got higher, right? So something about learning in the virtual world, they didn't learn enough to be able to retain that skill in the physical world. Then we said, okay, well, what is the impact of that on, what is the impact of the brain stimulation on learning? And what we found is that in particular, just for the virtual group, again, what you're looking at on the left-hand side is the one I just showed you, non-stimulation, you get worse from sort of evaluation in the virtual world to evaluation in the real world. But when you look at the group that got TDCS, they actually look more like the inanimate group, right? They learned, they got better from baseline to evaluation, and from evaluation in the virtual world to evaluation in the real world, they didn't get significantly better, they didn't get significantly worse, right? And so what we're seeing is that we don't, again, mechanical engineer here, not completely fully sure what's going on, but this is this is more of a ballistic style task, right? Where you need a really good feed forward model. It's theorized that that's what the cerebellum, one of its major roles is in this feed forward planning. And so something about getting the stimulation sort of helps you sort of learn the feed forward model well enough that you can transfer it regardless of the environment that you're in. That's at least the running hypothesis that we have right now. More, experimentation is actually needed to verify that. Okay, so last, as I close, how does all of this work that we're doing in telerobotics inform neurorehabilitation, right? So I started off by showing you the schematic that we think about robots as sitting at the interface between the body and the outside world. But when I think about rehabilitation, I think you can sort of think about it, and this is sort of maybe, my interpretation. What we're really thinking about now is that the body is actually sitting between the brain and the outside world. And we still got signals going from the brain through the body out to the world, and from the from the world through the body back to the brain. It is true that in the case of impairment, right, these signals are often corrupted or not, they've got issues, right? But we can still begin to think about applying similar principles that we apply in the robotics domain to thinking about how one thinks about controlling external or even, devices sitting on top of you, like in the case of a prosthesis. My lab has recently started getting involved in this space, looking at more of the sensory pathway, because that's sort of our area of expertise. And during the pandemic, when IRBs were shut down and we couldn't collect data, I had the great fortune of getting invited to write an opinion piece by Ashish Deshpande at UT Austin and Chad Rose at Auburn, thinking about sort of the road forward for upper extremity rehabilitation, and in particular looking at robotics rehabilitation. And one of the things that we sort of I gave our opinion on or thought about was sort of three key areas where we see benefits for robotics in the rehabilitation space. One of those actually is in sort of thinking about using robots for big data collection, and I'll come back to that. The other one has to do with sensory, sort of our understanding of sensory impairment. And because when you look at sort of the literature, there's a lot of work looking at motor impairment, but the looking at the sensory side, right? And we're thinking about sort of clinical sensory assessments. They're pretty nascent in terms of, our understanding of how someone's sensory system is actually impaired, let's say following something like a stroke. So taking the work that we've been doing sort of already in our lab, looking at sort of sensory perception. In this case, we ran a study where we found it actually for something like stiffness, right? So your ability, you go turn a doorknob, right? It has a certain stiffness to it. You actually have this perceptual asymmetry. You perceive stiffness better on one side of the body than you do the other. It's known that this is the case for other haptic cues as well. But sort of taking our sort of framework of using psychophysics and psychophysics style experiments, can we begin to use that in terms of understanding impairment of the sensory system, let's say after stroke. And so my grad student, Jake, who's actually here, has been developing this little sensorized device, very simple single degree of freedom device that, we've sensorized. We can measure positions and torques. We can measure sort of off axis loads. We can measure grip forces. And we begin to say, now, if we use that information, can we build a sort of understanding, maybe a model of what someone's impairment is? In particular, we're just looking at wrist function right now, which I know is a very simplified way of doing it. But then how do we turn that into our understanding of how well someone does an actual task, right? And can we begin to look at sort of what is the impact of sensory impairment on sort of closed loop sensory motor control? And can we tease apart the sensory side from the motor side? I should acknowledge that this is work that was sponsored by the IRE K-12 program, in which I see some of my fellow scholar colleagues here, in partnership with my clinical mentor, John Krakauer, and engineering mentor, Marcy O'Malley at Rice University. But when we think about sort of what is the role for computational modeling in this case, right? I sort of getting to the questions that we were asked, right? Can we think about using devices like these, right? So we're good. My lab, what we do is we build devices, right? And we build devices to collect data. Can we think about taking this data and using this data to inform sort of our aggregate understanding of something like sensory impairment? I know we've talked a lot about personalization here, but sort of do we even understand on a population level how the sensory system is impaired, right? And can we do a better job at actually understanding different levels of impairment and how they differ, let's say, for different joints, or maybe holistically when you look at full body motions in multiple degrees of freedom. Can we use that to basically build models to track and ultimately predict, what someone's level of recovery is going to look like? And then can we determine maybe the most effective, use that to basically determine what are the most effective rehabilitation approaches going forward? I should say that, this is not an idea original to mine. This is actually some work that I'm already doing in partnership with Dr. Jing Xu, who's at the University of Georgia, where we've got an instrumented hand device that we're looking at sort of hand dexterity after stroke. But then the question becomes, how can I leverage devices like these to come up with a global understanding of neuromotor function and neural rehabilitation? Last thing I'll say is that, this is already being done in other fields, in particular when you look at surgical training, right? There, the research field is rich with sort of putting sensors on robots and watching how people move and interact with the environments around them, and then using that information to build models to detect how skilled someone is. And so can we start to begin to do those same things in the rehabilitation space? Okay, I'm out of time. And so with that, I will just say thank you, and I'll take whatever questions you have if we have time.
Thank you for that really nice talk. I have a question about your TDCS simulation that showed that you were able to recover the deficit that was lost from VR training to real. Can you describe the timing of that TDCS pulse and whether or not that it differed during the learning task?
Okay. So the question was, describe a little bit more details about the TDCS in the VR to real world transfer task. And I'm digging in my memory to remember. The timing aspect. So it was provided continually during the training phase. We used a device that was double blind. And so all participants wore the TDS electrode, but we only turned it on for half of the group. And it was sort of in the sham phase for the other half of the group. But they did it for all 40 trials, and all 40 trials, I believe, lasted about 30 minutes. So about 30 minutes of stimulation continuously through and the goal was to basically do the task over and over and over again for 40 trials. No timing. Yeah, no difference. We turned it on right as they start. Yep.
Hey, great talk. I really like your idea of neural efficiency. And I'm wondering, when you're comparing learning in the virtual versus the actual suturing or whatever, how does the differences in the task, do you think, affect like this neural efficiency relationship? If you were to be recorded, I don't think you did, or were you recording FNIRS during like the learning phase of the virtual versus the actual haptic?
So we didn't do FNIRS on that
Okay.
task. I think that's actually an interesting question. That's one that we've been tossing around, is sort of where else can we do some of these neural efficiency metrics, and one of them is in the surgical training space. There is sort of for the sake of time, the last plot that I showed in the prosthetic space, you'll see that there were curves going up for all three groups, right? When we talk about neural efficiency. And so I think, we know that the more you practice a task, the better you get. And ideally, the better you get, the lower the cognitive effort it should take to do the task. Where sort of things plateau, or do they plateau, is sort of an open question. And I think that's a rich area to sort of understand. And we've got sort of in our mind, sort of some longitudinal studies that we can run where you do test, retest, even with the time gap in between them, to see sort of, is there a rebound effect when you come back and do the task over again? And do you have to relearn? Do you come to a different plateau? I think those are very interesting questions when you start to think about neural efficiency. And, and then what parameters do if I tweak sort of the control gain, how does it affect things?